Somewhere inside a lot of hot dogs, sausages, and chicken nuggets sold in the United States, there's an ingredient most people have never actually looked up, even though it's sitting right there on the label in plain text: mechanically separated meat. It's legal. It's disclosed, at least in name. And the specific rules governing exactly what counts as this ingredient versus what can still just be called meat without any special disclosure at all are meaningfully looser in the US than they are across the European Union, which makes this one of the more genuinely technical and genuinely interesting regulatory gaps we've covered on this channel. Let's start with what mechanically separated meat actually is, because the process itself is more mechanical and less mysterious than the ingredient's slightly ominous-sounding name suggests. After the primary cuts of meat are removed from a carcass during processing, there's still a meaningful amount of usable meat clinging to the bones, around the neck, the back, and other bony sections that are difficult and labor-intensive to trim by hand. Mechanically separated meat is produced by forcing those bones, with their remaining attached meat, through a high-pressure sieve or screen system, which physically pushes the soft tissue through small openings while leaving the larger bone fragments behind. What comes out the other side is a soft, paste-like meat product, since the high-pressure mechanical process breaks down the muscle fiber structure in a way that ordinary hand-trimmed or ground meat doesn't experience, given that grinding preserves much more of the meat's original fibrous texture than forcing it through a fine sieve under pressure does. In the United States, this ingredient isn't secretly hidden. There's a genuine federal disclosure requirement behind it. Since regulatory changes in the 1990s, USDA rules have required that mechanically separated meat be specifically declared in a product's ingredient list using the phrase mechanically separated followed by the specific species, such as mechanically separated chicken or mechanically separated pork, rather than just being folded into a generic chicken or pork listing. That's a real meaningful transparency requirement, and it's worth being fair to the US system on this point before getting into where the gap actually shows up. There's also a significant US restriction worth knowing about that came directly out of a major food safety crisis. After the 2003 discovery of a case of bovine spongiform encephalopathy, commonly known as mad cow disease, in US cattle, USDA moved quickly to tighten the rules around mechanically separated beef specifically, because BSE-causing prions concentrate in nervous system tissue, and because the mechanical separation process risks incorporating small amounts of spinal cord and other nervous tissue when bones like the skull and vertebral column are processed. USDA banned the use of mechanically separated meat sourced from cattle skulls and vertebral columns for human food entirely, a rule that remains in effect today. That's a genuine, significant US regulatory response, and it's part of why mechanically separated beef specifically isn't really part of the American food supply the way mechanically separated chicken and pork still are. It's worth understanding a bit more about why the US labeling requirement came about in the first place, because it wasn't something USDA introduced proactively. It followed years of public controversy and consumer advocacy pressure. Before the specific mechanically separated labeling requirement was established, this ingredient could, in various forms, be incorporated into products and sold under much more generic meat labeling, without consumers having any clear way to know it was there at all. Consumer advocacy groups and some members of Congress pushed specifically for mandatory species-specific labeling through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, arguing that a product this structurally different from conventionally cut or ground meat deserved clear disclosure rather than being folded silently into a generic ingredient listing. That pressure eventually produced the labeling rule we have today, a genuine regulatory improvement over what came before it, even if it still leaves the production method gray area we've just walked through only partially closed. That history is worth keeping in mind because it's a useful reminder that US food labeling requirements across nearly every category we've covered on this channel have tended to arrive incrementally in response to specific public controversies, rather than being built from the start as a single comprehensive compositional framework the way EU meat regulation was designed. The EU's calcium content test and quantitative disclosure requirement emerged from a more centralized, deliberately engineered regulatory process, built specifically to close labeling loopholes proactively rather than reactively following a public health crisis or a media controversy, the way several major U.S. food labeling changes, mechanically separated meat labeling included, have historically tended to happen. There's also a species-specific wrinkle worth mentioning because it shows the EU's approach isn't applied with identical strictness across every category either. Poultry-derived, mechanically separated meat is generally treated somewhat more permissively across both systems than mechanically separated red meat, in part because poultry bone structure and the resulting recovered product carry a different risk and composition profile than mammalian bone does, and mechanically separated chicken in particular remains a widely used, clearly labeled ingredient across both American and European processed poultry products, including a meaningful share of chicken nuggets, sausages, and similar processed items sold on both sides of the Atlantic. The core US versus EU gap. This video is really about isn't whether the ingredient exists at all. It clearly does in both markets. It's specifically about how rigorously each system defines the category and how much quantitative detail consumers actually get once that ingredient shows up on a label. So here's where the actual gap between the US and EU systems shows up, and it's more subtle than a simple banned versus legal story. It's about how each system decides what counts as mechanically separated meat in the first place, which turns out to matter enormously in practice. The US approach to classifying this ingredient has historically been tied significantly to the specific production method and equipment used, which created a genuine gray area that consumer advocates and food safety researchers have flagged repeatedly over the years. A related process called advanced meat recovery, which uses somewhat lower pressure than classic mechanical separation systems, can in some cases produce a product that retains enough of its original muscle fiber structure to avoid triggering the formal mechanically separated classification and its associated labeling requirement, even though the underlying goal, mechanically recovering residual meat from bones using specialized equipment, is fundamentally similar. That distinction, based partly on subjective assessment of how much the meat structure has been altered rather than purely on a fixed, objective, compositional test, has meant that some products processed through advanced meat recovery systems have been able to be labeled simply as beef or pork in the ingredient list without the specific mechanically separated disclosure that a more aggressively processed batch from the exact same bones might have required. It's worth walking through why calcium content specifically became the EU's chosen measurement, because it's a genuinely clever piece of food science engineering once you understand the underlying logic. Muscle tissue itself contains very little calcium, while bone, and particularly the marrow and cartilage that inevitably get incorporated when meat is forced through a sieve under pressure alongside bone fragments, contains substantially more. That means a laboratory can test a sample of finished meat product, measure its calcium content precisely, and use that single number as a reliable indicator of how much bone-derived material made it into the batch, entirely independent of what production method, equipment brand, or pressure setting the manufacturer used to get there. A producer could theoretically adjust their equipment or process specifically to avoid triggering a definition based on production method alone, but they can't meaningfully adjust the actual physical calcium content of what comes out the other end without genuinely changing how much bone material ends up in the product. Which is precisely why regulators consider this kind of compositional testing a harder standard to engineer around than one based primarily on classifying the machinery or process itself. The European Union took a different approach, specifically designed to close that kind of gray area. Rather than classifying mechanically separated meat primarily based on which specific equipment or pressure level produced it, EU meat regulation defines the category using an objective compositional test, measuring the calcium content of the finished product. Because mechanical separation processes, even relatively gentle ones, tend to incorporate small amounts of bone particle and marrow into the recovered meat. And bone contains substantially more calcium than pure muscle tissue. Calcium content serves as a measurable, harder-to-gain proxy for how much bone-derived material actually ended up in the final product, regardless of which specific machine or pressure setting was used to make it. If a product's calcium content exceeds the EU's defined threshold, it has to be classified and labeled as mechanically separated meat. Full stop, independent of what the manufacturer wants to call the production method that got it there. That's a meaningfully harder standard to work around through equipment or process adjustments than a classification system that leans more heavily on production method definitions the way the historical US approach has. There's a second related difference worth knowing about too. The EU's food labeling framework includes what's called a quantitative ingredient declaration requirement, often referred to by the acronym QUID, which requires that when a specific ingredient is emphasized on a label or is one that a reasonable consumer would want quantified, its actual percentage in the finished product has to be disclosed numerically, not just listed by name in descending order of quantity, the way US ingredient lists typically work. When mechanically separated meat is present in an EU product in a way that would trigger this rule, the label doesn't just have to say the ingredient is present. It has to tell you roughly how much of it is actually in there. US labeling requirements don't include an equivalent general percentage disclosure rule for this ingredient. American consumers get the ingredient's name and its position in the descending order list, which tells you it's not the single largest ingredient if it's listed further down, but doesn't tell you whether that means 5% of the product or 35%. Put together, these two differences mean the EU's system is stricter along two separate dimensions simultaneously. A harder, more objective compositional test for what counts as mechanically separated meat in the first place, closing off the kind of production method gray area that's existed in US regulation, and a quantitative disclosure requirement that tells European consumers not just that the ingredient is present, but roughly how much of it they're actually getting, a level of specificity American labeling simply doesn't require. It's worth being fair to the US system here too, because this isn't really a story about hidden danger. The USDA's underlying safety review of mechanically separated meat, when it is properly identified and used within permitted limits, hasn't found it to pose a distinct food safety risk compared to conventionally processed meat. Setting aside the specific BSE-driven restrictions on beef sourced from skulls and spinal columns, which the US has already directly addressed through its own targeted 2004 regulation. This is much more a transparency and consumer information gap than a safety gap. The EU's system simply gives shoppers more precise, harder to manipulate information about exactly what they're buying and how much of it is in the package, while the US system provides real but comparatively less granular disclosure with a known historical gray area around advanced meat recovery that the calcium-based compositional test was specifically designed to prevent. So practically, here's what you can actually check the next time you're buying sausage, hot dogs, or similar processed meat products. First, check the ingredient list specifically for the phrase mechanically separated followed by a species name. If you see it, you're looking at a product that's using this ingredient and disclosing it under the current US requirement, even without a specific percentage attached. Second, know that mechanically separated beef sourced from skull and spinal column material has been prohibited in US human food since 2004, so that specific BSE-driven concern has already been directly addressed at the federal level, regardless of any other differences between the US and EU systems more broadly. Third, if you're specifically trying to avoid this ingredient category entirely, rather than just understand its presence, look for products explicitly labeled whole muscle or naming specific cuts directly. like pork shoulder or chicken thigh, rather than a general species name alone. Whole muscle labeling claims are a much stronger signal that mechanical separation wasn't part of the product's production process at all, compared to simply the absence of the specific mechanically separated phrase, given the production method gray area we've just walked through. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including USDA mechanically separated meat labeling rules, the 2004 BSE-related advanced meat recovery restrictions, and EU meat composition and quantitative ingredient declaration regulations. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Regulations and product formulations change over time, so always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're heading to the grill. The specific preservative combination in a lot of US barbecue sauce that can form trace amounts of a recognized carcinogen under certain storage conditions, and why EU regulators have taken a more cautious position on it than the FDA has. Subscribe if you want to see exactly what's in that bottle.